Say a few words about this group, and then I can already talk about the participants. So this is an activity, a webinar arranged by group Postcolonial Perspectives on and within development studies. It's an EADI group by a German organization. Myself, Aftab Nasir, and my colleague, Dr. Julia Schoenberg, who is also involved as the convener of the group. For some reason, her throat is not very fine, so she asked me if I could moderate the first half of the session. So just a bit about the group for the people who are new or who may not be familiar with the activities. This was founded 1.5 years ago, and the very basic idea was simple. It was simply to share knowledge between the researchers and without hierarchical mechanisms. The idea is that the researchers of the South, of anybody working also in the North, could exchange ideas, information, and talk more freely in a comfortable environment. For this purpose, this group came into being. We had a very, very enthusiastic and very good organized conference panel in August in Bergen, Norway. And the idea of webinar developed from that activity, which brings me to today. So today we have two speakers with us, Dr. Anindya Sekhar Purakaista. I'm sorry, Anindya, if I'm mispronouncing your name. And Dr. Epifania Amoo-Adare. I hope everybody can hear me well. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our first, that is Dr. Epifania, and he will speak for 15-20 minutes roughly. Her topic is Unthinking Science, Critical Literacies for Post-Normal Times. This was a talk that she gave at Governance and Sustainability Lab, Yale University earlier this year. What you hear today is a shorter version of this talk, which was titled as Decolonizing Urbanism, Transformative Perspectives. So, who is Dr. Epifania? So Dr. Epifania is an independent scholar, as well as associated researcher at the Center for Development Research, Bonn University, Germany. She did her PhD in education from UCLA and is also Areva Part 2 qualified architect who has been working for over 26 years in the fields of education, international development, and social housing in countries like Afghanistan, Georgia, Ghana, Qatar, the UK, and the US. Critical spatial literacy is her key area, but her interests extend further to epistemology, poetry, feminisms, and decolonial or postcolonial studies. She's a very good friend of ours, of Julia's and mine, and she has been kind enough to agree to talk to this webinar. So without further ado, I would like to welcome Epifania to start her talk. Epifania, over to you, please.
Okay, and please, everybody bear with me as I just switch, because this is fairly new to me, but I think I've got it. Okay, perfect. So I'll just start, and really what I'm going to do today is provide you with what considering the 15 to 20 minute time frame, I'll describe as sound bites in relation to this presentation, which I did earlier, as Aftab mentioned. But also I want to thank Aftab and Julia for organizing this session, and to thank everyone who is in attendance for actually being on this virtual community, so to speak. What I want to present today is what I describe as an intellectual piece of work that was linked to my 3 years tenure with the Center for Development Research, ZEF, in Bonn, Germany, and working specifically on the Crossroads Asia project. And within this project, what we were interested in was in rethinking area studies and understanding how to do so. And there were several colleagues involved in this task. I think when the project in its first phase had, I would say, about 20, 25 scholars involved, but in the second phase, which was, the first phase was 4 years, second phase 2 years, it had a smaller group of people because really this facilitated being able to have more meaningful discussions about the research and understanding how to rethink area studies. So I joined at the tail end of the first year, and my main role was trying to look at how theories on the multidimensionality of space would be useful in rethinking area studies. As a consequence of this work, what really happened, and it was actually not my original mandate, but rather came about through doing the work, was that I began to see that there was perhaps a need for what I call as an unthinking of science, as we currently know it and many of us live it. And really this call, I see it as being within many of the debates and arguments for the need for us to have a renewed approach towards how we do scientific research. And this being calls for having research that is multiple, that's intersectional, that's transgressive, and potentially open-ended, but also research that many would say is non-Western. And what I'll do here now is just present you with the whys, quick arguments on whys, and then some arguments on perhaps how to do so. And my slide is not moving. Am I doing something wrong? Okay, there we go. So the first why, really, there are many reasons, but the first argument I'll make here is really linked to this question of the increased mobility of people, goods, capital, and ideas. But not only this fluidity, but also that in relationship to this fluidity is also uneven geographies, and that bringing with it certain contestations over canon, and that canon being both land territory, so warfare, and also canon being knowledge as well. But what many argue, for example, Uri within mobilities studies, argues that this fluidity in some ways no longer justifies, one, the division of the world in fixed areas, but also it demands of us different ways of trying to analyze the complexity of this fluidity. Van Schendel, for example, also talks within geography that we no longer can talk about trait geographies, for example, but we need to move more towards process geographies. And all of this as a consequence of understanding that there's more fluidity than fixity. And in the same vein, Thomas Nile, who is a continental philosopher, talks about the importance of the figure of the migrant and how the migrant is becoming a political icon of our time because it's pushing us to rethink this idea that we currently have that mobility and movement is actually an aberration, because in reality, he would argue the aberration is more to do with the fixing of nations and nation states. But all of this really arguing for the need for some kind of innovative forms of knowledge production that take into account these dynamisms. Some of the uneven development, as I mentioned, is also argued that perhaps this uneven development is to do with the crisis of capitalism. Scholars like David Harvey talk about this a lot, and really that this crisis in capitalism is what results in many of our social struggles. For example, one can look at the expanding gap between the 1% and the rest of us. But that in certain ways, this question around the crisis of capitalism speaks to the need to unthink science, but here more so from a political standpoint than perhaps, say, a technical standpoint. That is the reason for some scholars' argument for rethinking. But adding to this, another reason, which will be argued by the scholars in future studies, for example, is this question of we live in what Zaidun Sadat describes as post-normal times. And these are times in which we are in a world where he believes that chaos, complexity, and contradiction prevail. And because of this, and this question of uncertainty, that we can no longer be reduced to using more linear modes of thought, linear analytical tools, and so on and so forth. So, for example, within future studies scholars, Ryle Miller advocates for what he describes as a free anticipatory approach, the emerging discipline of anticipation or futures literacy. And within this, he argues that uncertainty can, for example, should be considered as a core analytical aspect of of science. And these scholars provide us with many different theories around the different kinds of futures we have, the different levels of uncertainty and so forth. But really, their bottom line is that the uncertainty of the future that we have, even though there's some aspects that we argue that there's some certainty around. So, for example, shallow uncertainty being the idea that this talk is going to go on for 20 minutes, but again, still we do not know. And so they argue that really having this requires a certain kind of collaborative creativity and ethical imagination. And this is one other reason for unthinking or rethinking science. Another reason why I would argue would be what Manuel Lima puts forward. And he talks again about this complex world, but the fact that it's also entangled, and in some ways he describes it as being networked. And that this network nature or entangled nature of the world we live in requires what he describes as a paradigm shift from the use of tree metaphors, which used to be used in the past to look at problems of simplicity, but moving us towards other kinds of metaphors that can deal with the organized complexity of our current times. And for example, he argues that these metaphors would be non-hierarchical, decentered, non-signifying, and they are embodied in concepts such as rhizome or networks, for example. Another reason I would put forward for why we need to unthink is really about the stories that we have been told. And by stories that we have been told, what I'm really looking towards is certain kinds of stereotypes, certain kinds of misrepresentations that we have all in some ways gotten to know, and some people have not only known them, but actually lived the consequences of them. And this might be looked at as stories that are gendered, that are racialized, that are heteronormative, stories that are binary and hierarchical, for example, stories that are told within ideas like colonialism, development, war against terror, and so on and so forth. And there's a good video, if people have a chance, hopefully Aftab and Julia might be able to share it with you, but it's a good video that looks at Edward Sayid and arguments around Orientalism that speaks to this point. But I think more importantly for us here, what I think is important is that research writing is also a form of storytelling. But I would argue that is a more dangerous kind of storytelling, because in many instances, research writing is assumed to be or is read as being the whole truth and nothing but the truth. And this becomes important because, especially for decolonial scholars like Ramon, who looks at this notion of the westernized universities. And they, in a certain ways, with westernized knowledge, certain kind of disciplines, certain kinds of discourses, and so on and so forth, we have some kind of storytelling that results in policy, practice, theories, discourses, and so on and so forth. But he would argue that these narratives or these stories are not representative of the pluriversal world of knowledges that we actually live in, of the multiple ways of being and ways of sensing worldviews and so on and so forth. And so he asks this critical question for academics, I would say in particular: how is it possible that a canon of thought in all of the disciplines of the social sciences and humanities in the westernized university is based on knowledge produced by a few men from 5 countries in Western Europe, and as well including the USA? And this becomes an important point that is raised, that is arguing perhaps from a more political stance for an unthinking and also an untraining of us. And Boaventura de Sousa Santos, for example, would argue that our untraining requires acknowledgement of the autonomous and enabling diversity in the world. So this is not just diversity of people, places, locations, cultures, and so on, but also diversity of knowledges as well, I would say. And so this, in some sense, brings us to ourselves in a way. And here I would argue that, you know, as knowledge producers, we're very much implicated, especially more recently in particular kinds of neoliberal imaginaries about knowledge as commodity, knowledge as economy, the privatization of it, the patenting of it, the commodification of it, and so on and so forth. And I would also argue that much of this element of knowledge also is, how can I put it, either mediated or directed or channeled through certain kinds of Cartesian thinking, certain kinds of binaries, certain kinds of hierarchies. And this really requires of us an understanding of the politics of who, where, what, why, and how of our scholarship. More than this, I would argue here, and here I'll read a little bit just to emphasize my point, that I think we need to unthink science, perhaps by inhabiting the ambiguous and frustrating instances of these false hierarchical binaries with all of ourselves, our bodies, our minds, our hearts and souls. We have to find a way, I would argue, to link our selves, our multiple selves, into our work and leaving nothing whatsoever behind. And for me, I begin to see this unthinking as a need for us to learn to think with more than only our minds, but also with our hearts, because there is science that says our hearts also have some form of memory. And so in this way, we need to consider knowledges that are not only read through the textual, like I'm doing at the moment, but also heard through the ears, smelt, tasted, and I would even argue intuited and sensed on both physical and metaphysical planes. And now I want to perhaps go through a little bit of the how, and I'm hoping I'm still with time. And with this how, I want to emphasize that a lot of this already exists. So some of it is not new. Some of it perhaps has not yielded fruit. Some of it may have even yielded failures in certain contexts, because it is in some ways looking at trying to develop some kind of paradigm shift. But the first, I would argue, the most obvious way towards unthinking is recognizing that the kind of world we live in needs different kinds of approaches. So inter, multi, cross, trans, and post-disciplinary approaches to knowledge. So shifting our perspective in that regard. And I would argue that post-disciplinarity, at least in my mind, holds the most significance, a strong significance, because some would argue it is about, in some ways, adhering to disciplinarity whilst also not. But really what it requires of us is to transgress into knowledges beyond our own disciplinary training, so we can try and understand this world we live in. And there are already fields, I'll say, that do this. So one would argue that cultural studies, mobility studies, feminist studies, for example, already do this. But the reason why this becomes important is that Buckler feels that post-disciplinarity will, and I'll quote, evoke an intellectual universe in which we inhabit the ruins of outmoded disciplinary structures, mediating between our nostalgia for this lost unity and our excitement at the intellectual freedom its demise can offer us. And aside from her, Louise Gordon also talks about the importance of this because of what he describes as disciplinary decadence. And this is where disciplines, as he would say, and now also quote, disciplines lose sight of themselves as efforts to understand the world and have collapsed into the hubris of asserting themselves as the world. Now, for me, engaging in post-disciplinarity, in some sense, also begins to speak to what Walter Mignolo, a decolonial theorist, would argue in terms of this notion of delinking. But it also, I would say, speaks to Ramon Grossfogel's call to decolonize the westernized university. And here he specifically uses westernized because he wants to emphasize that this is not about universities or academia that is solely in the West, because in many locations around the world, they are westernized universities. And for him, he believes that part of this decolonizing of westernized universities would be one, acknowledging that the kind of knowledge we look at or that we engage in, Western knowledge, in many ways is provincial, but is also epistemically racist and sexist, and is rooted in four epistemicides that he points out. And I can speak to this perhaps in question and answer if there's any question about what those are. But he also says another way we perhaps can do this is breaking away from universalism, especially of Euro-North American knowledge production, and also about bringing in epistemic diversity to the canons of thought within universities. I would also argue that, and another important aspect, I think, in relation to thinking, is really trying to engage in multiple critical literacies. So by this I mean finding ways to critically read not only the world we live in, but the word as well. And for example, within the field of education, Douglas Kellner talks about the importance of multiple critical literacies for our postmodern times, where he believes we should be looking critically at multimedia, at the media, at social, cultural, ecological, print as well, and looking at them critically to see how they transform our lives, inform our lives, and so on and so forth. But I would also argue that also looking at critical spatial literacy, so understanding how the built environments that we live in, how those ideologies associated with them predispose us to particular kinds of behaviors. And this becomes important. Why? Because as Ferry says, reading is not exhausted merely by decoding the written word or written language, but rather anticipated by and extending into knowledge of the world. Reading the world precedes reading the word, and the subsequent reading of the word cannot dispense with continually reading the world. Language and reality are dynamically intertwined. The understanding attained by critical reading of a text implies perceiving the relationship between the text and context. So in many ways, this would be why critical reading is important, but beyond that, also then a critical rewriting of the word and world, which in many instances we do through our work, through research that turns into policy and practice and so on and so forth. And the reason why rewriting is also important is because, as Linda Tuiwai Smith would argue, and she's a scholar of Indigenous education, and I quote, "Writing can also be dangerous because we reinforce and maintain a style of discourse which is never innocent." And here, when I talk about writing, I want to emphasize that I don't want to privilege the written text, right? Because there's many forms of writing, even, and some of which are even embodied. And I think of performance art and so on, as well as areas that begin to even help us shift rewriting and thinking about how we rewrite the world. Beyond that, I would also argue that as scholars, we need to engage more with positionality as a concept, and by doing this, also recognizing the situatedness of knowledge, because as we all know, knowledge is produced in specific circumstances, and those circumstances shape it in some way. And you can see, for example, with this cartoon that I have, that it's almost like similar knowledge, but is being shaped or understood in completely different ways. And for this reason, the importance of positionality and understanding that researchers are positioned by age, gender, race, class, nationality, sexuality, institutional affiliation, intellectual predisposition, education, history, and other aspects of our personal circumstances and experiences. And all these in turn mediate our production of knowledge. And so for this reason, we would recognize that we cannot be all seeing or all knowing researchers because of this idea of understanding our positionality. And so this brings me closer to my conclusions, which are that in considering these, what really comes to mind is that we need to radicalize our approaches to science. And perhaps this can be done by post-disciplinarity, as I've mentioned previously, but also this idea of becoming border workers, and I mean working on the borders of knowledges, but not only of knowledges, but also working at the borders of the academy versus the world out there, policy and practice, theory and practice, and so on. But also perhaps looking at threshold theories, how we might be able to co-construct threshold theories. And this is a term that Anna Louise Keaton, who's a feminist scholar, talks about in her book, I can't remember, Transformation Now, looking at post-oppositional politics. Another way could be looking at scholarship that is for social justice, also about scholarship that's about practice, so this constant praxis. Here I use Paulo Freire, the education theorist's term praxis, which is about this idea between action and theory, reflection and action, and there being an iterative process constantly between those two, knowing and doing as well. And in that way, then, I'm thinking certain kinds of normative modes of science that we become used to. And some scholars are already doing this by pushing for slow research, for example, by pushing for embodied research, by pushing for contemplative research, collective research, research that is spiritual, research that is non-Western, research that is indigenous or takes more indigeneity more seriously. And just to give some examples of someone unthinking processes, here I present what education scholar is mainly within higher education, Laura Rendon, is involved in. She has coined this phrase, academics of the heart. And with this, for her, academics of the heart has three main elements. One, viewing research as a relationship-centered process, so where the knower and what is to be known exist in a relationship to each other. Two, honoring the diverse ways of knowing. And three, engaging in contemplative practice, self-reflection and introspection, whilst always connecting the inner and outer nature of knowledge, that is connecting ourselves to the external world. But the relationship-centered process also, she looks at this question of also having a relationship between art and science. So bringing what she describes as the heart to one's mind-oriented research. And she looks for a lot of her inspiration from indigenous movements, indigenous thought, indigenous philosophies. And her notions around the heart also speak to other theorists who are looking at questions of what's the role of the heart, or what's the role of love in science, what's the role of love in activism. So I'm thinking of Chicana feminists looking at decolonial love. And there are many, like I think Chela Sandoval is one with her book Methodology of the Oppressed. But others are looking, like Anders Berman looks at the Aymara indigenous thought and their understanding of the idea that we think with both our hearts and our minds. And then there's also a scholar like Dustin Crown who's looking at bringing the heart, but from an Islamic perspective, into research in order to unthink it or rethink it. And I think I've already mentioned this in some of the approaches, but to give another example, in looking at being border workers, really this is looking at Gloria and Zaldua's legacy in certain ways. And for her, borderlands, it can be found in physical geography, race, ethnicity, sexuality, class, gender, language, and psychological frames of mind, all of which must always be crossed. And in crossing them, this she sees as being a kind of reconstitution of the oppressive, hegemonic, and patriarchal conceptions and realities of those borders. And then consequently becoming a reconceptualization of the boundaries of life. And here you see a poem of hers where she's really talking about this, and with the second half of which is the Spanish part of it, she's really talking to the idea that her soul moves between 2 worlds, 3 worlds, 4 worlds, and that her head is buzzing with ideas that are contradictory. But yet she sees herself as being guided by all these contradictory voices that speak to her simultaneously. And I mentioned Anna Louise Keating earlier, but she picks up from this idea of Gloria and Zaldua's to talk about this idea of threshold theories, where you're then talking about theories that sit at the connection of the interchange or the crossroads or whatever term you want to use, or the borderlands of multiple ideas that may well be contradictory. Aside from conceptualizations and research practice, also is this idea of decolonizing methodologies, and that there are calls seeing that this is an important part of thinking, and I'll argue the same, and mainly because method, as we all know, is as much about acting on the world as it's about knowing it. And for me here, I even think of the connections between this and quantum physics, where they talk about how at an atomic level, how particles change their behavior only because we are actually observing them. And this, for me, has grand significance for this idea of if only observing a particle can change it, how much more acting or moving, talking, and what have you within that. There are many examples within indigenous methodologies, for example, that help us towards thinking how to decolonize methodology. So Linda Tu, Y. Smith, who I mentioned, Margaret Kovac is another one, Rodolfo Kusch, and many, many more. But I think that also in looking at decolonizing our methodologies, what this might perhaps even lead us to is what is described by Sahara as an ethnographic refusal, where we actually will have moments as researchers where ourselves collectively with research subjects would actually decide not to give data to academia, be that for personal gain, and in some ways end up risking our own selves and careers for others or for a greater cause or good, and what have you. And then coming to a close, I just have 2 more slides. I would believe that another important part of unthinking is also the teaching aspects and activating critical pedagogies. And here what I'm thinking about is that we need to find ways to teach students and ourselves how to transgress knowledge boundaries, because I can imagine that it's not something that just happens because we want it to be so, but that we actually need to find strategies and modes and mechanisms for doing so, especially because we work and live within existing systems that may differ. And critical pedagogy, as I give an example, this comes from the field of education, becomes important here because it's designed to serve the purpose of both empowering educators and teaching for empowerment as a theory and a mode of practice that has been developed and used by education scholars especially, and teachers as well. And its roots come out from Paulo Freire, who I mentioned. Critical pedagogy is important because it asks what is the relationship between what educators do in the classroom and efforts to build a better society. And so this becomes significant. But not only that, through a critical pedagogy approach, we really look at this idea of understanding ourselves and the students as being social agents in the world that we live in, and being capable of anger because of our capacity to love. And this becomes important and brings the question of love again into unthinking of science and into teaching ourselves to unthink science. So finally, I would say that in many ways, unthinking is unlearning. It is also about some form of open-ended becoming of ourselves as scholars, as scholar activists, as scholar artists, as scholar whatever hyphen. And the reason why this is so is because in many ways learning is not something that happens in parentheses. It's not something that we bookend in the classroom as this graphic show, cartoon shows. Neither is it something that is bookended in a momentary academic career. In many ways, learning is unlearning, right? It is about living and about becoming, believing and disbelieving. It's about ambiguities. It's about things we are unable to pronounce, and much more. And here I will end, and I'm presuming you were able to hear what I had to say. And thank you.
Wow, thank you so much. You were very good at giving such a big topic in such a small format. So I really thank you for your talk. So now I would like to hear from our audience. If anybody has any questions, they can raise hand. They can use raise hand button and directly ask Epifania any question you want. So we have one from Wendy. She wants to know, can you explain more about embodiment, please?
Yes, as I understand it, is really, I think, embodiment of this idea of bringing the body into one's work or one's thought. It really came out of, I would argue, feminist thought, and was and was raised as something that is important, mainly because there was this notion of the mind-body split, and that in many cases we only are our minds. And it was really this idea of seeing how the body in certain ways plays a role in whatever arena that we're in. And I think that at least my understanding of it, or thinking about embodiment, is that it's not just about, at least I'm coming from the perspective of my interest in critical spatial literacy. So it's not only about a conscious use of the body, let's say in a classroom as you're teaching, but it's also for me a conscious understanding of the role that your body, and be that your phenotype or sense of self, height, weight, what plays in the kinds of conversations that are being had in the room, the kinds of learning that take place, the kinds of interactions that take place, and so on and so forth. And for me, I feel it also extends to the affective as well. So in terms of the role of emotions as well in this, how can I put it? In the interactions that are taking place.
Oh, thank you. That makes sense. Okay, we have 2 more questions. If there is no live question, I can start reading the ones we already have. So Maria wants to ask, could you elaborate a bit about westernized epistemologies connected to the Western university?
Okay. My sense, actually, this is an interesting thing, and I have to think about it in many ways, because the reason why I feel I have to think about it is because I feel as if there are multiple strands, and there are strands that are in this in academic arenas, but there's also strands that are within the popular domain as well. And in my view, perhaps to give an example, is I see it in ideas around development, for example, and what it means to develop as a society. What does it mean to develop as a society or a country? And these being certain ideas that have come out of, in some context, a particular, I don't know whether to call it cultural encounter, but I'm thinking of this period of colonialism, so to speak, and how that colonial encounter, colonial moment has changed certain kinds of, well, it's hard to say trajectories because we didn't know what those trajectories would be, but let's just say has changed certain kinds of modes or ways of being as a consequence of that encounter. And not solely because of benign sharing, but in many instances also because one group's way of being has been defined as being questionable, problematic, absent perhaps of religion, absent of soul, absent of even humanity in certain times in our colonial history. And much of this has continued to today. And it's not to say that, and let me look at the question, it's not to say that these epistemological discourses or ideas around being, knowing, and so on are all problematic and malignant and so on and so forth. No, I think it's more to say that in many instances they have become the be-all and end-all of life. So if I'm to give an example that's not linked to academia, I think of skin bleaching, for example, which on the African continent in some ways is becoming an epidemic in certain arenas. And a lot of this is linked to notions of what beauty means. And I give that as an example.
Thank you. That is very well summarized again. I guess Julia also made the request, but I'd like to say it out. Please, our participants, do speak up. We would really love to hear from you. We'd love to hear your voice. But if there's nobody yet, I have 2 more questions for you. One is from Tariq.
Is it Julia's?
The one was from Julia, and there were other 2 ones. I was keeping Julia's one for the last one.
Okay.
But
so
go ahead. You can see the questions. Please see which ones you want to address first, second.
That's an interesting question, Tariq. I mean, like, why is it important? Well, I guess, in my view, I think it's important because it exists, it's there. And so if something exists and we say we want to understand it better, then it must become a part of that understanding. Or my argument becomes, which I know I've said for my own self and for others as well, is that sometimes we need to let others know who we're excluding when we present certain ideas. So, for example, I look at the majestic we's in research, or research that sometimes that doesn't situate the knowledge and says we do this and we do that and people like that, but it's not talking about people everywhere. It's talking about people in a very specific location at a very specific time. And for me, that's where the dangers come in, and where in certain ways diversity doesn't exist, whilst it is suggesting a sort of a work like that suggests a kind of universality that we all are a part of. So for me, yeah, diversity is important because it already exists. We live in a world that is very diverse in many ways, and in some cases even disparate.
Okay, thank you. So then we have on India's question it's a very unfortunate event that he was supposed to speak, but because the sound is so much broken, he cannot hear us, we cannot hear him. There has been some going on in his city for last 2 days, and that could be a reason of his bad internet connection. We would like to get him back at some other point for sure. But for now, I guess he has a question for you. He wants to ask, can we have post-disciplinary without addressing the materialistic conditions of the global capital that allows only a monolithic structure of episteme?
I would say no. I would say no. But, and I need to think about that, because I need to actually see that question. But post-disciplinarity without addressing the material, right? Is that?
Yeah, material conditions of the global capital that allows only a monolithic structure of episteme.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Yeah, I mean, in my mind, I think it definitely has to be addressed, but I feel in certain ways by being or beginning to engage in post. No, I have to think about this. No, I have to think about this question a bit more. I need to think about this question a bit more.
Okay.
Yeah.
So why don't we keep it for the last?
Yeah. But the other thing I also think is that in my mind, it isn't also an either or, it's a both and. So I feel like because I remember one of the things, and I don't know if the conversation was even with yourselves or who we had this conversation with, but I was feeling that in some ways we are tasked with creating new visions whilst having to make it possible for everybody to even experience something out of the vision that we have that may be lacking, if you know what I mean. So it's like there's two kinds of work, I think, that are constantly going on. And so for me, yeah, anyway. But I think I'll leave it there because I'm not 100% clear, but I have a sense of what he's asking as well.
Okay, but yeah, maybe we can later come to this question. Okay, then we have Pauline, if I'm not wrong, and she wants to ask, can you elaborate or brainstorm on strategies or mechanisms to create the institutions or structures we work within that are not yet ready to deal with post-disciplinarity embodiment?
Yeah, I mean, this is a difficult one that I say many are still working with, and the strategies range from creating collective responses, creating communities of practice, quitting those environments, and so on and so forth. And many of them are still in the making, I would say. So I would say there's a range, and that it's really, in my mind, also very much about a collective effort that is linked to very specific locations, and that is tied to questions of risk and the kinds of risks that people are willing and able to take. I would also argue that depending on what discipline you're in, or what field you're in, or what institution you're in, some people are in situations where they're able to engage more substantially with post-disciplinary ideas without there being any consequences. But when it really matters, it matters, if you know what I mean. So I think the strategies or mechanisms will differ from place to place. They'll differ based on those involved in creating and trying to develop those strategies, and how much push they can give, and how much people are willing to risk.
Thank you. And just to add further on this point, I guess this very initiative, this collective, is sort of, in our mind, it's a kind of a strategy we are trying to also use to do exactly what the question was about. We are trying to create a sort of a collective that could address that. Okay, I'm not wrong.
And the other thing I'll add is that sometimes you're able to do more when it's perceived as being just a technical shift versus when it's perceived as being a political shift.
Yes.
In the way things are being done.
Absolutely. Okay, so now I guess the last one on my list of questions is from Julia. I have one, but I'll ask it after this. So then Julia was asking how to achieve post-disciplinarity if we can't even make inter or transdisciplinarity work.
Yeah, I just think it's one day at a time.
Okay.
Because as I mentioned that some of what I was presenting is work or efforts that already exist. Some bear fruit, some have failures, some bear fruit and then have fail. You know, it's like a back and forth. But I think for me, what is at least graspable is this idea of it being about a mindset change. So I just think even if only looking at an individual level, this being aware of within one's own work, where the silences are, where the absences are, what's being excluded, and knowing why. And as in some ways, as much as possible, being able to let whoever your audience is also know that this is going on, or that you're aware that it's going on. Right? Okay. Yeah, but I think in terms of, yes, as a way of being that is predominant everywhere. I don't know, this might take a while, but I do think certain fields, as I mentioned, that within cultural studies, within feminism, mobility studies, there is a beginning to this. But of course, there's certain boundaries which are linked to funding, which are linked to publication hegemonies and careers and so on and so forth. Yeah.
Okay. Okay, and I guess you have already talked about this question about why diversity is desirable in knowledge production, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Although I'll say some sectors is really interesting. Sorry, I should say why is interesting. I think of, this language and how language acquires certain kind of baggage. So diversity itself as a word with English has acquired a whole lot of baggage that is linked to multiculturalism, multicultural education, and diversities in workplaces and so on and so forth.
Okay.
So I can see the problematics with the term, but
yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
And I have just one last quick question. I was thinking while you were talking, what is the difference between rethinking and unthinking? Can we say that this rethinking process is part of that unthinking process? And while you were talking about Mignolo, to me looks like that this very school of thought is quite radical in its approach. They want to sort of completely move away from whatever was Western, or let's say the ideology. No? I mean, I remember at one point I was reading him and he says, how can I use Bourdieu or Foucault to make sense of the realities I am living in? They are irrelevant to me. But on the other on the other hand, what you just mentioned that maybe at some point you are not simply throwing the baby with the bathtub, but still trying to sort of navigate your space in between. So please try to say something about it. Is it rethinking?
I think in my what I'll describe as nascent understanding of decolonial theories, I thought that they were also saying the same thing, that it wasn't so much throwing the baby out with the bathwater, but it was about, how can I put it? It was about recognizing that that certain hierarchies, certain ways of knowing have been imbued with certain hierarchies that are problematic, one, but also has been reviewed with certain kinds of universalisms that do not exist. Okay. And that in order to understand the world we live in, we need to tap into the many sources of understandings and knowings and ways of being in the world that we live in, which may include some coming from Western knowledge. And so, okay. At least this is the way I understood it. But essentially, understanding that although we might do that we still want to ensure that we de-link from certain kinds of racist, gendered, and in some ways heteronormative understandings of the world that we live in. So in my view, I think they're not totally throwing the baby out with the bathwater, because you can even see that from even their scholarship and who they reference. So the point is that to not only reference Foucault, but your grandmother, if your grandmother said it, or I admire ways of being and thinking and so on. So to really tap into this diverse pool of knowledges that we have, that's one. You asked about the rethinking versus unthinking. I think for me, the reason why unthinking was important was that for me, and even for myself, I find it difficult because I have been educated in the school in this very sort of mind, thoughts, preoccupied way of being. But it was very much this idea of how to be able to tap into other ways of understanding the world we live in, how to be able to tap into my dreams as well and see them as being relevant to understanding a particular phenomenon. And that my dreams may be equally relevant to it as well. How to understand how my emotions might be equally relevant to understanding a certain phenomenon, to understanding the material, how to understand the metaphysical. And for me, to be honest with you, now being located in Ghana physically, and listen to conversations where people are talking about social struggles that are taking place in the material and the metaphysical plane, it becomes real to me. It becomes real to me that, I need to not only be looking at this one describes as, you know, just objective realities, but also these narratives and stories, but these other aspects that cannot be seen and for some might be considered to be non-existent, right? But for others that are real.
Yeah.
That people. So here I find colleagues and friends of mine who returned and people here are negotiating both physical and metaphysical planes when they're struggling in their daily lives or trying to understand their daily lives or understand why they're not succeeding in life or trying to, you know, yeah. And in that kind of terrain, you begin to see that, oh, there's something that has been totally excluded within scholarship in a sense. That is perhaps more central than one thinks.
Okay. Well, thank you so much. So just a last call if there's any other question, or I have few announcements to make before we end the meeting.